What do you know about King David? To many, David was the young shepherd who defeated Goliath, a gigantic Philistine warrior with just a stone and a sling, a brave boy who faced and defeated Israel's greatest enemies, the dreaded Philistines. But what if I told you that all of this happened before David became king? After being crowned king of Israel, darkness invaded him. David turned into a ruthless man, committing crimes and unforgivable atrocities, even against his own people. This is the true story behind King David. In this episode, we will reveal why he went from being a noble shepherd to a ruthless king. Did he become corrupted by the great power he attained? Or was it a woman, the wicked Bathsheba, who darkened his heart to the point of killing over 70,000 Israelites? Or maybe he always had that evil within him, hiding it all along. David was just a young shepherd when his father sent him to deliver food to his brothers. They were on the battlefield because the Philistines and Israelites were at war. But the army of Israel was paralyzed by fear in the face of the gigantic Philistine warrior, Goliath. Goliath was nearly 3 meters tall and had been challenging the Israelites to send a champion to fight him in hand-to-hand combat for 40 days. Upon arrival, David heard Goliath's taunts and was outraged to see that no one in the army of Israel dared to face the giant. He also heard the rewards promised to whoever defeated Goliath, the hand of the king's daughter, and a large sum of gold. David presented himself before King Saul with an outrageous proposal: he would fight Goliath. Saul, incredulous, tried to dissuade David, telling him, "You cannot go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war since his youth." However, David, with unshakable faith, responded, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." His words were so full of conviction that Saul had no arguments left. Then Saul offered David his own armor and weapons, but the young shepherd rejected them. Instead, he went to the stream, picked up 5 smooth stones, and approached Goliath armed only with his sling and his faith. Goliath, seeing David approach, let out a mocking laugh and yelled, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" But David, with a firm and full voice, responded, "You come to me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted." Suddenly, David ran toward Goliath with surprising speed. He reached into his bag, pulled out a smooth stone, placed it in his sling, and with a quick and precise movement, he slung the stone with all his might. The stone soared through the air and embedded in Goliath's forehead with brutal impact. The giant staggered for a moment, his eyes rolled back, and he fell face down to the ground, raising a cloud of dust. Goliath lay dead, felled by David's unshakable faith. Without wasting time, David pounced on the inert body of Goliath, took the giant's sword, and with a precise blow, cut off his head, raising it and shouting, "This battle is the Lord's." Then, the Philistines, seeing their champion fallen, fled terrified from the battlefield. But the Israelites, intoxicated with victory, launched into a relentless pursuit, determined to finish off their enemies once and for all. That day, the news of David's feat spread quickly throughout Israel. The young shepherd became a national hero, admired and celebrated by all of Israel. His name was on everyone's lips, and his fame grew day by day, but not everyone shared that joy. King Saul, hearing the praises for David, was filled with jealousy and suspicion. He began to see the young man as a threat to his own power and popularity. The seed of envy was planted in his heart, and he still had to keep his word and give the hand of his daughter to David. But Saul had an idea to get rid of David and asked for a dowry of 100 Philistine foreskins, hoping that David would die in the attempt. However, David returned with 200 Philistine foreskins, fulfilling and surpassing the challenge. Saul had no choice but to give him his daughter as a wife. At this point, David had achieved fame and power, but he had taken many lives with his hands, and this would be the seed that clouded his faith and awakened his dark side. Then one night, Saul, filled with anger, entered David's room and threw a spear at him, but he missed. The spear embedded in the wall, and David quickly fled through the window, escaping into the night. Although David became a fugitive hiding from King Saul, he had two opportunities to kill him. The first was in the depths of a cave where Saul, vulnerable and defenseless, was at the mercy of David. The second was one night when the king was sleeping in his camp, totally unprotected. However, David spared the king's life on both occasions, showing loyalty and compassion. David spent months escaping from the king's soldiers, cornered and with no options. He was forced to seek refuge in enemy lands. The Philistines, Israel's greatest enemies, became his only hope for survival. David, the warrior of God, now had to live as an expatriate, waiting for the moment when he could claim his rightful throne. And that day did not take long to arrive. The death of King Saul marked the beginning of a new era. David, the anointed of God, was crowned king of all Israel, uniting the tribes under his command. But David set his sights on recapturing the fortified city of Jerusalem, the Jebusite stronghold. With a bold and strategic attack, David conquered the city and established it as his capital, the center of his kingdom and the spiritual heart of Israel. In an act of devotion and joy, David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem with music, dance, and sacrifices. The people celebrated the presence of God among them. David, the warrior king, became a spiritual leader, guiding his people in worship. It was then that God revealed an eternal covenant to David, promising him that his offspring would reign forever, telling him, "I will raise up after you one from your loins, and I will establish his kingdom." Thus, David, a humble shepherd, became the founder of an eternal dynasty, a lineage that would culminate in the Messiah. But David did not stop there. He led his army in impressive military victories against the Philistines, Moabites, and other enemies who fell before the power of Israel. Thus, David expanded his kingdom, establishing Israel as a regional power. But this was the moment when David began to fall into darkness. In one of the victorious battles, David subdued the Moabites, and after defeating them, he lined them up on the ground and measured them with a cord. This measurement determined their fate. 2/3 of the prisoners were executed, and the rest were pardoned and converted into his servants. This act of brutality began to enlarge his dark side. He was completely filled with power and had the blood of his enemies on his hands. He began to lose his discernment between good and evil. Then, Bathsheba arrived in the midst of his glory and power. David succumbed to temptation. From his palace, he saw Bathsheba, an extremely beautiful woman, bathing in the privacy of her home. Desire consumed the king, clouding his judgment. In an act of abuse of power, David sent for her and lay with her. But David did not know that Bathsheba had become pregnant. Bathsheba was married to a great soldier in his army, and the scandal began to spread as Bathsheba's belly began to grow. In a desperate attempt to cover up his sin, David hatched a sinister plan. He called Uriah, Bathsheba's loyal husband, back from the battlefield to his home. David hoped that Uriah would sleep with his wife and thus hide the paternity of the child. But Uriah was an honorable soldier and refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his comrades fought in the war. Frustrated and cornered, David resorted to a dark decision. He sent Uriah back to the front with a sealed letter for Joab, the commander of the army. In the letter, David ordered Joab to place Uriah on the most dangerous battle line and then retreat so that he would die. Uriah, unaware of the betrayal, delivered the letter to Joab in the heat of battle. Uriah was abandoned by his comrades and fell dead by the swords of the enemy. This betrayal marked the beginning of David's internal corruption. While Bathsheba mourned her husband, David took her as his wife, believing his secret was safe. But the eyes of God saw everything. God sent the prophet Nathan to confront David, unmasking his sin with carefully woven words. Nathan tells the parable of a rich man and a poor man, saying the rich man with his vast flock welcomed a traveler into his home. Yet instead of taking one of his own sheep, the rich man coveted the poor man's only sheep. David's anger ignites upon hearing the story, and he vehemently declares that the rich man deserves death for his despicable act. But then, Nathan, with a piercing gaze, points his finger at the king and pronounces the words that shake his soul, "You are that man." In an instant, reality strikes David like a slap in the face. The parable is but a reflection of his own sin. He had coveted another man's wife and shed innocent blood to cover his transgression. Nathan, with prophetic authority, pronounces God's judgment on David, saying, "The sword will never depart from your house. Shame and chaos will arise from your own home." The king who once danced with abandon before the Ark of the Covenant now stands naked before the truth of his sin. But Nathan also gave him a message of mercy. Although David's sin would have devastating consequences, God would not take his life. David's story does not end in the darkness of his failure, but in the light of divine redemption. David prostrated himself before God, repentant and tearfully saying, "I have sinned against the Lord." But this repentance would not save him from the consequences of his sin. The son born of the adultery with Bathsheba fell gravely ill and died on the seventh day. And something terrible was about to happen in his family. In the royal palace, a dark and twisted tragedy unfolds. Amnon, David's firstborn, burns with lust for his half-sister Tamar. With a wicked plan, Amnon feigns illness and asks Tamar to serve him in his room. When she arrives, Amnon violently grabs her and sexually assaults her, despite her desperate pleas. After satisfying his depraved desire, Amnon throws Tamar out like a used rag. Tamar flees, broken and filled with shame, covered in ashes, and with her robe torn. Absalom, her brother, comforts her and watches with growing rage, swearing to avenge his sister's dishonor. David, upon learning of the atrocity, is filled with rage but does not punish Amnon. His silence is deafening. For 2 years, Absalom's hatred ferments in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Until one day, Absalom sets a trap, inviting all the king's sons to a sheep-shearing feast. In the midst of the celebration, as wine clouds the senses, Absalom signals his servants. Suddenly, in the midst of drunkenness and confusion, Absalom's servants stab Amnon, killing the aggressor of their sister and the firstborn of King David. Fearing his father's wrath, Absalom flees into exile for 3 years, feeding his bitterness and ambition with cunning and charisma. Absalom wins the favor of the people, stealing their hearts with promises of justice, and in secret, he plots his rebellion against David. Seeking to snatch the throne from his father, Absalom marches toward Jerusalem, forcing David to flee the city. The once powerful king now walks barefoot and with his head covered, weeping as he climbs the Mount of Olives. Absalom enters Jerusalem triumphantly, taking over the palace and his father's concubines, fulfilling Nathan's prophecy. But Absalom's rebellion was doomed to fail. In the decisive battle in the forest of Ephraim, David's forces defeat the rebel army. Absalom, fleeing on his mule, rides under a large oak but gets tangled in the branches, leaving him suspended and defenseless. Then Joab, David's general, seizes the opportunity and thrusts 3 spears into Absalom's heart, ending his rebellion and his life. David, upon hearing of his son's death, bursts into a heart-wrenching lament, crying, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you?" Thus, the consequences of David's sin culminate in the deaths of 2 sons and a shattered daughter, all because of the same sin lust. After this family tragedy, there comes good news for the family. Solomon, son of David and Bathsheba, is born. The child conceived in sin serves as a tangible reminder of the consequences of David's actions. Yet God does not forsake David or his descendants. The prophet Nathan, the same who confronted David with his sin, comes with a message of redemption. By divine command, the child is named Solomon, which means peace. Solomon grows up in the shadow of his father's sins, but also under the promise of divine blessing. David, aware of his own faults, dedicates himself to guiding his son in the ways of wisdom and righteousness. With words laden with emotion and urgency, David instructs Solomon, "Know the God of your father and serve him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought." Yet the darkest chapter in King David's story was still to come. In a moment of unchecked pride and ambition, David succumbs to the temptation to count his people. Despite warnings from Joab, his general, David insists on conducting a census, seeking to measure his power and glory in numbers. But this act of vanity defies the sovereignty of God, the true ruler of Israel. God's wrath is kindled against David, and the prophet Gad presents him with 3 options for punishment: 7 years of famine, 3 months of military defeat, or 3 days of plague. David, acknowledging his sin, chooses to fall into the hands of God, whose mercy is great, rather than into the hands of his enemies. David, seeing the devastation caused by his arrogance, prostrates himself before God with a broken heart, saying, "I am the one who has sinned. I, the one who has done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house." In an act of repentance and atonement, David buys the threshing floor of Araunah and builds an altar, offering sacrifices to appease divine wrath. The plague is stopped, but the scars remain. Israel has been decimated, and David bears the weight of the lost lives. The warrior king who once defeated giants and conquered nations now faces the fragility of his own humanity. In his darkest moment, David learns that true greatness lies not in the number of his subjects, but in humility before God. Thus, amid the storms of his life, David finds refuge in the presence of God. With a transparent and passionate heart, he pours his soul into poetry and music, giving birth to the Psalms. He wrote over half of the 150 Psalms in the Book of Psalms, some as famous as Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." These compositions, born of joy and pain, victory and failure, become an eternal testimony to David's intimate relationship with his Creator. On his deathbed, David anoints Solomon as his successor, transferring the mantle of leadership to the next generation. After a 40-year reign marked by triumphs and tragedies, David breathes his last. The warrior king, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the man after God's own heart, closes his eyes forever. His body is laid to rest in the city of David, Jerusalem, the city he conquered and transformed into the capital of his kingdom. Solomon, the son of redemption, becomes the bearer of the divine promise destined to lead Israel to its greatest splendor. Solomon, the richest and most powerful king of Israel, inherits a known sin in the family lust. Click on the video because you need to know the story of Solomon, the wisest king in the Bible, who had a great weakness for women, just like his father David. Solomon's lust led him to fall and lose everything. Don't miss this biblical story of Solomon.